I think the biggest pressure that Ismay is under is by this self-appointed role that we touched on earlier as the intermediary between Churchill and the chiefs of staff, which he sees as being so important. And it's a very uncomfortable piece of ground to be standing on between the chiefs of staff and Churchill. And he writes at one time about Churchill, he writes, often he would send for me after he had read a chiefs of staff comment on his own proposals. He would storm, curse me, saying, what the hell is this? Accuse me of aiding and abetting the chiefs of staff, crumple up the paper and throw it on the floor in front of me.
Hello. On the 25th of December 1941, General Alan Brooke was appointed Chief of the Imperial General Staff, the commanding officer of the British Army during the Second World War. His new boss, Winston Spencer Churchill, was a harsh taskmaster with high standards and who had no problem with sacking generals. But he had a helping hand in the form of General Pug Ismay, soldier, statesman and diplomat. Joining today are two historians, John Kiszely, the author of a biography of Ismay, and Gordon Corrigan, author of a book on Churchill. Today we discuss the dynamics between the three men and other generals such as Montgomery, Wavell and Auchinleck. Links to what we discuss are in the show notes. Please do subscribe and follow, and if you can grant a generous review, I'd be most grateful. But until then, I'm going to hand you over to me, John and Gordon on Churchill, Alanbrooke and Ismay. Welcome, Gordon. Welcome, John, to the podcast. Great pleasure to have you on both.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
I was very keen to get you both on. John, in particular, because you've been on the podcast recently talking about Pug Ismay, and now I think growing in reputation thanks to your recent biography, excellent biography, that's been very well reviewed in the issue in our magazine that's coming out later this month, actually. And talking about Ismay and his role during the Second World War, which we only touched on probably about 20 minutes worth of the episode we discussed Ismay, and his relationship with Churchill and, of course, Alan Brooke, who becomes the chief of the Imperial General Staff if I've did my homework, in December 1941, which was later as I remember, actually. But anyway, so I wanted to just kick off, really. And Gordon is the author of Blood, Sweat and Arrogance, a book about the myths of Winston Churchill, of which there are very few. I mean, he's a great man, and we can all agree on that. And so really how the relationship between Churchill and Alan Brooke and Ismay, as they worked as a threesome. And so I wanted to start off really with yourself, John, in that Ismay is, I think, appointed to cabinet in 1940 in April. Is that right?
Not quite.
I.e. before Churchill becomes Prime Minister.
No, you're absolutely right that before Churchill becomes Prime Minister, when Chamberlain is still Prime Minister, that Ismay is appointed to be the Chief Staff Officer to Churchill in Churchill's capacity as Chairman of the Military Coordination Committee, and is also appointed to be a member of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the committee of the three heads of the three services, Army, Navy and Air Force. So that's what he's appointed to. He's actually still the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet. So he's attending Cabinet, but not as a member, as Secretary.
I see. And so this is, of course, Churchill then becomes Prime Minister quite soon after, on the 10th of May.
Right. Yes.
And so the current CGS is John Dill.
The Chief of the Imperial General Staff, CIGS.
Yes, sorry, CIGS. Yes. We don't have an empire anymore. Alan Brooke had fought in France during 1940, and we can get to that. So Dill as a CIGS, Andrew Roberts' book on Churchill, and get his view of Dill. And Dill really, it seems, he's described as dilly-dally, I think, by Churchill, in that he and Dill didn't really get on, and Ismay didn't really rate Dill either. So should we perhaps kick off with Alan Brooke's predecessor and Ismay's view of him?
Yes, I think Gordon and I are going to disagree on this because let Gordon produce his view, but certainly Ismay felt that Dill didn't handle Churchill well, that Dill easily took offence. And if Churchill was rude about the army, Dill was just bitterly resentful of it. And Dill lacked repartee, which is what Churchill loved, somebody who he could make outrageous comments to, who would not feel hugely resentful, but would bounce back. And Ismay was able to do that. Ismay said that when Churchill made outrageous insulting remarks to him, he either laughed or changed the subject, or if it was rude about the army, he reminded Churchill how complimentary he'd recently been about the army and in writing, and sort of made a joke of it and passed on. Dill couldn't do that. And for all his other many qualities, it was a very important piece in interpersonal relationships with Churchill that just didn't work, in my view.
The relationship didn't work. I think it was very unfair to Dill. Dill was a highly intelligent intellectual. There aren't many soldiers who are intellectuals, and I think Dill was one. And of course, one of his problems was trying to persuade Churchill not to invade Schleswig-Holstein, for example, or lots of ideas that Churchill would come out with, which were militarily ridiculous. And Dill had to persuade him not to do it. And perhaps he didn't persuade him in as tactful a manner as he might have done. But if you're the professional head of the army and somebody insults the army, then you are going to fight back. I think the great thing about Ismay's great ability, it seems to me, was to act as he said himself, the man with the oil can, because he did manage to tone down Churchill's more ridiculous ideas, and the chiefs of staff's resentment of some of the things that Churchill wanted to do. I mean, they saw Churchill as interfering in things that he didn't understand, sacking people because they wouldn't tell him what he wanted to hear. But I think Dill, when he went to America, did a terrific job there. He's, I think, the only foreigner to be buried in Arlington. I've been to his grave in Arlington, and it's wonderful. It's an equestrian statue with Dill on a horse. And that's how highly the Americans thought of him. And he did a brilliant job with persuading the American chiefs of staff, particularly people like King, who was basically didn't like the British, to acquiesce with what the British, not necessarily what the British wanted to do, but at least to compromise. And so that really is what we should remember Dill for. But I do think that he was a good CIGS, and I think he was badly treated by Churchill.
Okay, well, that's our first criticism of Churchill. Hopefully there won't be any more. So, John, Ismay, I was reading in your book, actually, after the Norway adventure, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Churchill asks Ismay, and we'll get to Alan Brooke because he's not been appointed yet, but Churchill asks Ismay what Ismay thinks of Churchill's ideas for Norway. And Ismay very sensibly gives a brilliant response in that, don't ever ask me what I think of your ideas, because this job won't work.
Yes, that is very much the message that Ismay liked to give the world, that he wasn't going to interfere in anything, and that he'd told that to Churchill. And there is no real evidence for that, apart from one of Churchill's secretaries who quotes this, but that person was not one of Churchill's secretaries at the time, and it must have come to secondhand to him. And actually, to think that Ismay never in private made any suggestions about strategy or made any comments on Churchill's plans, I don't think is something that actually happened. I think Ismay did this, but he was very keen on giving the image that he never involved himself in strategy. And part of this was because he had a very difficult relation to keep with the chiefs of staff. And he felt that if they thought he was giving a lot of private advice, contrary to their advice to Churchill, the relation between Ismay and the chiefs of staff would have completely broken down. And in that, I think he was correct.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. The chiefs of staff would have been suspicious. He is an officer who is junior to them and is clearly in the pocket of the Prime Minister, or at least very close to the Prime Minister. So, of course, they're going to be careful to begin with. And it did take some effort by Ismay to get the confidence of the chiefs of staff, which he did. And it says a great deal for him that he was able to retain the confidence of Churchill and of the chiefs, when often the chiefs and Churchill were at absolute loggerheads. I mean, Norway, which we've just mentioned, I mean, Norway is probably one of the greatest cock-ups in our military history. Entirely the fault of Churchill. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. It was his cock-up, and it was that propelled them to power. And Ismay had to keep this balance, which I think he did exceedingly well. I suspect that in the small hours of the night when there was just the two of them, Churchill and Ismay, perhaps Ismay did make an opinion, but he was very careful to be seen as being not having any opinions, as being simply a man who could persuade both sides frequently antagonistic to each other, to actually compromise and talk to each other and deal with each other, particularly in cases when, there were times when the chiefs of staff or some of the members of the chiefs of staff were going to resign, which would have been a disaster in the middle of the most intensive war we'd ever fought. And Ismay comes out of all of that very, very well, I think.
Yeah, you've touched on it, something, Gordon, though I completely agree with you about the Norway campaign, that Churchill bore a very large part of the responsibility for the dreadful cock-up that was the Norway campaign. But of course, the relationship that he had with the chiefs of staff then was part of the problem, because this was a clash of big egos, Churchill's enormous ego and the egos of very senior service officers, which sadly is often the case, that these big egos exist. And it's one of the reasons that I got really interested in writing a book about Ismay, that when you read the accounts of meetings of the chiefs of staff, whether formal or informal, and the clashes, shouting matches that happened between the chiefs of staff and Churchill, there's one voice throughout all of this that is unemotional, analytical, common sense the whole time, suggestions about how to achieve success. And that's this chap, Ismay, of whom I'd never really heard before. And I thought, when I finish this book about Norway, I'm really going to research this chap, Ismay, and see if there's a book that can be written about him. And throughout the war, Ismay retains his cool the whole time. When these big egos are clashing, and sadly, the shouting matches and acrimony between the chiefs of staff and Churchill continues throughout the war, Ismay is there realizing that this can't continue, seeing the whole thing in context, that the show must be kept on the road at all costs, that resignations by the chiefs of staff, and you're absolutely right, 3 times, I think, in the war they threatened to resign, that if the show's to be kept on the road and there aren't to be these constitutional crises that would result from the chiefs of staff resigning, that sadly Churchill and the chiefs of staff have got to be persuaded there is a middle way and a reasonable course of action that avoids these awful, disastrous outcomes.
But if Norway hadn't happened, just as you mentioned Norway, then we may have still had Neville Chamberlain. So that's something to contemplate.
Well,
yes, but
Chamberlain, now remember, history is written by the victors. And that means it was written. I mean, Churchill said, history will be kind to me because I shall write it. And of course he did.
And he did.
Chamberlain was the man in 1935 who wanted to fight the election on rearmament. And Baldwin wouldn't let him because he said the Labour Party would never go for it, and neither would the company. But Chamberlain wasn't a kowtowing, forelock tugging to the fascists. He realised the danger, and he did want to rearmed. Now, of course, he died, so he presumably, if he'd stayed as prime minister, he'd have died anyway. But I do think Chamberlain's been badly or unfairly judged by history. He had no option at Munich. I mean, if you read the local newspapers of the time and read the letters column, you get a good idea of what sort of people are thinking. Not the national press, because they've got an agenda, but the local press. It's quite clear that nobody wanted to go to war with Germany in 1938. People weren't frightened of the Nazis; they were frightened of the Bolsheviks. That was what people were frightened of, not the Germans. So I don't think there was anything else Chamberlain could have done. And I don't think Chamberlain was the pathetic creature that subsequent historians have painted him as. But that's only my opinion.
No, I think some historians are quite right. Some historians have been unkind to Chamberlain. My own view is that Chamberlain was a very respectable peacetime prime minister. But by his own admission, he was not a wartime prime minister. And he says so in private letters to his sisters, that, I'm a man of peace. I'm not a wartime prime minister, I'm paraphrasing him. And, I will have a major part to play when it comes to establishing, regaining peace. But personally, I don't think he would have proved a wartime prime minister, but that's all speculation.
Well, Alan Brooke had fought in France during the Dunkirk evacuation. And so, John, I'd just be interested in what position did he have? Because is it Field Marshal Gort who was in command in France, or is he general?
No, Gort commands the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF. And you're quite right. Brooke is one of his core commanders and performs very well by common agreement during the campaign. And then he comes back. He, for a while, has an appointment in the Southern Command, and then becomes the CIGS when Dill is sacked in December 1941, as you mentioned.
And so, was he really the only man for the job when Dill is sacked? And who would Ismay have been a key player in deciding who would become the CIGS? Because, of course, you've mentioned it already, Gordon, but Ismay is a major general, and of course, this role is for a full general.
Well, he did say very clearly when he accepted the job with Churchill that he would not have any part in the selection of senior officers. I would have to say that. I mean, if people thought that he was, I think by this time he's a lieutenant general, in fact, but if people thought that he was involved in the selection of senior officers, his position would have been intolerable. So when he said, I will not get involved in that, I don't think he had any involvement. He would have had his own opinions, but I think he probably kept them to himself.
And I think that's absolutely right. He approves of Brooke's selection as CIGS, and later writes after the war that of all the 8 chiefs of the Imperial General Staff for whom he worked or was associated with, Brooke was clearly the outstanding one of all of those.
And who else was potentially in the running?
Well, Ironside he'd been looked at and really wouldn't have been up to it. Gort had been it and wouldn't have been up to it. There was a dearth. I mean, there was a real shortage of able officers. One of the reasons why Auchinleck is brought back from India, because there's so shortage of officers capable of being corps commanders. So I think Brooke was probably the only realistic candidate. And although he's not the sort of chap that one would necessarily want to have at a dinner party, I mean, he was what we might call a black prod. But the great thing about Brooke, I mean, apart from his ability usually to make sure Churchill's more ridiculous ideas didn't happen, what I liked about him was he went off to lunch every day in his club, and he took weekends off, and he went bird watching. And we have seen, and I know John will have seen it at a much higher level than I have, but I've seen it at sort of my level, commanders who will not leave the job alone. And the result is that they start making stupid decisions. Commanders have got to rest. They've got to get away. And this is how I think Brooke was able to remain throughout the war, from the time he was appointed right to the end of the war, without having a breakdown or going doolally, because he took time off. I mean, more recently, you may remember the fuss when Charles Guthrie was on holiday and somebody got killed, and there was a great cry in the tabloid press. Why is the CGS on holiday? Well, of course he should be on holiday. The CGS isn't responsible for every single private soldier. Actually, I was on the same company command as Charles Guthrie. He was a very amusing chap when he was a young major. And this is where Brooke was absolutely right. He insisted that commanders have to get their rest. One of the few things that I admire Montgomery for, and I don't like Montgomery, as you know, Montgomery insisted. He went to bed every night at the same time every night. He had a solid night's sleep, woke up in the morning, was not to be woken up unless there was something absolutely critical. And commanders have got to get their rest, have got to get their sleep. So full marks to Brooke for that. My criticism of Brooke, he did tend to look after his chums. Now, I know we all do that. We all tend to promote people who are like ourselves, and I suppose that's understandable. But I mean, he always looked after Montgomery. I personally think Montgomery was a very adequate, very average general, and I think he was grossly over-promoted. But he'd been a divisional commander under Brooke, and Brooke always looked after him. And of course, Brooke saw his chance when Gott was killed in North Africa, and they got rid of Auchinleck, I think unfairly, but that's only my view, and then put in Montgomery, and he looked after Montgomery, and some of the things Montgomery did, anybody else would have been sacked for, but Brooke. So that is a criticism of Brooke. I think he tended to, a bit of nepotism there, but otherwise, as CRGS, I absolutely agree that he was the right man for it, and I think he did a cracking good job.
Interestingly, Monty was one of the very few senior officers who Ismay disliked, and he doesn't mention this dislike anywhere in any of the public documents, his memoirs or anything else. But he very much disliked Montgomery's arrogance and his denigration of other officers, like his predecessor in the desert, Auchinleck. And Monty remained one of the people who Ismay really couldn't work with, even when Ismay was Secretary General of NATO, and Monty was the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe. This carried on, that they really couldn't work well together.
Now that's an indication of how difficult Montgomery is, because Ismay, by all accounts, was very easy to get on with.
Absolutely. But I do agree with Gordon and many other critics. If Montgomery was alive today and a senior officer, he wouldn't ever have become a senior officer. Montgomery today, unless he had completely changed his outlook and his methods, would never rise in the army above the rank of major.
Right.
Not least,
he almost didn't.
Could not work with allies. Today, any senior officer, anybody above the rank of major, has got to be able to work with allies.
Yeah.
And when it appeared in 1944 that he could not work with allies, totally upsetting American commanders, Bradley, Eisenhower, Brooke should have sacked him, but he didn't for the reasons that Gordon has given.
Yeah, I mean, Tedder, who was, of course, was a Brit, who was Eisenhower's 2IC, said that he said he must be sacked after Goodwood. But of course, if you create a messiah and then you find he has feet of clay, it's very difficult to remove him. I mean, interestingly, he keeps missing out on promotion boards to Major General before the war. And a lot of people junior to him get promoted. He misses out. I mean, he gets it eventually. And he does do well as a divisional commander under Brooke. But I quite agree. I mean, even as a major, he'd be bloody impossible, actually.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars.
Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
Okay, so if we go to February 42, because this is where we have a pretty disastrous set of events. I mean, there's been a disaster before that, but we see this fall of Singapore. I think I'm right in saying that's February 42. Pick me up if I'm wrong. And this is described by Churchill as the greatest military defeat, the greatest British military defeat, I think, of all time. And so, what's the sort of reaction of Ismay and Alanbrooke at the time? I mean, Churchill wanted Percival to fight on. I think you, Gordon, might have had a bit more time for Percival than certainly Churchill did.
I think Churchill, I mean, poor old Percival actually had written when he was a G1, when he was a colonel staff officer in Malaya or Singapore, I can't remember which, wrote a paper about the defense of Singapore. And it was a very sensible paper, which ended up in a pending tray somewhere. So he knew what the problems were. He tried to get them put right. They weren't put right, all the question of funding and available assets and all the rest. But Pershing was unfortunate in that he looked like a bank clerk. I mean, he was... the soldiers should, if possible, look reasonably impressive. I mean, they're trying to impress people. They're trying to, persuade people to do things that they normally wouldn't do if they got any sense. And if you're sort of terribly small and you've got buck teeth, totally unfairly, absolutely unfairly, but he sort of loses out. And the fact that Singapore was, and Malaya and Singapore, was appalling nonsense. But again, it was a lot of it was to do with lack of funding pre-war. I mean, go back to 1919, and Lloyd George says we can afford to take chances with defence. We can't afford to take chances with welfare and the 10-year rule, which Churchill was largely responsible for saying that the 10-year rule would be running on. It would be 10 years from today and 10 years from tomorrow. And
what's the 10-year rule, Gordon?
Well, the 10-year rule was that this was brought down by Lord George after the war, that there will be no major war for 10 years and the army is not to prepare for one. Now, this allowed them, of course, not to spend anything. I mean, you look at what happened between the wars, the sort of funding. The army, I think, bought 3 tanks between 1919 and 1935. There was no funding. What funding there was went into the Air Force, and in a way that was probably right, bearing in mind what happened. But there was no money for anything. And, the nonsense about all the guns were pointing out to sea in Singapore, no, they weren't. There were guns pointing landwards. The problem was the ammunition. The ammunition was armor piercing, which is great for ships, but it's no good for infantry and tanks and whatnot. And what you want for that is high explosive and shrapnel. So Percival, I think poor old Percival, he wasn't as bad as Churchill thought. But Churchill, there was no black and white with Churchill. You make a mistake, if Churchill thinks you've made a mistake, that's it, you're black, you're damned. And it's very difficult to come back. I mean, some people did, but he sacked Wavell. Wavell made a mistake in the way he dealt with Churchill. Wavell said to himself, this man is not very clever. I'm not going to waste a lot of time trying to explain my case with him. Wavell said Winston's military knowledge stopped somewhere halfway through the Second Boer War. There was certainly no truth in that. And of course, he gets sacked. And perhaps if Wavell had been more diplomatic, that might not have happened. Auchinleck, again, Auchinleck said, I can't do anything until the end of September, and he gets sacked. Montgomery gets away with not doing anything until the end of October. So, Percival was just another one. It takes one charlatan to spot one. I mean, his promotion of Wingate. Wingate was a failed suicide in the Middle East. And now, if you can't kill yourself, you're not really going to be terribly good at killing the enemy. But because Wavell then had a soft spot for him, he got away with it. And Churchill takes a liking to him, takes him across to I think it was the Quebec conference. He he runs the Chindits. Now, when I was a very, very young officer, had the temerity to ask Field Marshal Slim what he thought of Wingate. And he said that the only thing you could say for the Chindits was that it made good headlines in the press in the UK, but he didn't think realistically that they'd actually contributed anything. And if you look at what happened to the first Chindit expedition, how the handful of them came back riddled with worms, with dysentery, almost starved. I mean, I've talked to a few old Gurkhas who were on the Chindit thing, and their view of Wingate is probably unrepeatable.
Okay, so Churchill had his favourites, but John, I don't know if you want to comment on anything Gordon said there. Quite a lot to get through.
Sorry.
Well, Ismay is very interesting about Churchill's relationship with commanders such as Wavell and Auchinleck. That, again, as with Dill, Wavell handles Churchill very badly. Wavell is very taciturn, doesn't immediately come back with repartee, liable to remain silent if Churchill says things to him. And in any case, and Ismay reveals this not again in public documents, but in letters to private conversations with people, which is why a biography of him is so interesting, that he also is quite critical of Wavell in private, says that Wavell had an awful lot of luck and that Wavell didn't insist when he should have done, that troops shouldn't be diverted from the desert. Wavell himself admits that if he'd known that Rommel was going to be the German commander and arriving in North Africa, just how good he would be, he would never have made recommendations to or allowed Churchill to take troops away, for example, to go to Greece in 1941. And Ismay's interesting too about Auchinleck, who's a very personal friend of his. They served together in the Indian Army. And when Auchinleck has a major dispute with Churchill, having just taken over from Wavell, Auchinleck says that he can't possibly carry out an offensive operation for several months. And this infuriates Churchill. And Ismay writes to him and says, Claude, you must come back straight away from Cairo and have a face-to-face meeting with the Prime Minister to explain the difficulties that your command is under and the reasons why you need to postpone this offensive. And you can only achieve this with Churchill if you come back and do it face-to-face. And sadly, Auchinleck does not take this advice. And his biographer, John Connell, says of Auchinleck's decision, it was probably the worst decision he ever made, not to come back and get Churchill back on his side. So these are interesting insights that because Wavell is so close to Churchill and spends such a lot of time with him, just the two of them together, that, you know, he can give if you like, it's seeing his times through the prism of Ismay's view, that he can give these insights, which give us a better understanding of Churchill and some of his really eccentric judgments and decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the great things about Ismay, almost until the day he died, he is a servant of the state. I mean, from being Assistant Secretary of the Committee for Field Defence to Churchill's staff officer, to his brief period as Secretary for the Colonies, then his Secretary General of NATO. I mean, he's almost like the Duke of Wellington in that sense. And I've got, I mean, a lesser man would have gone completely bonkers very, very quickly. I mean, Ismay did have one or two breakdowns. They weren't mental breakdowns, but simply exhaustion. But I mean, he's to be greatly admired for lasting, you know, right throughout that extraordinary period.
I think the biggest pressure that Ismay is under is by this self-appointed role that we touched on earlier as the intermediary between Churchill and the chiefs of staff, which he sees as being so important. And it's a very uncomfortable piece of ground to be standing on between the Chiefs of Staff and Churchill. And he writes at one time about Churchill. He writes, often he would send for me after he had read a Chiefs of Staff comment on his own proposals. He would storm, curse me, saying, what the hell is this? Accuse me of aiding and abetting the Chiefs of Staff, crumple up the paper and throw it on the floor in front of me. And that was commenting, I never picked it up.
Yes.
But it shows how difficult one Churchill could be to work for. And on this, Brendan Bracken, one of Churchill's cronies, wrote to Ismay after the war saying, when the boss was in a bad temper with the brass hats, you were greeted with a rolling salutation. You are nothing but a lackey of the Chiefs of Staff. What a life you had, Pug, because the Chiefs of Staff were equally saying that you were Winston's Man Friday. This just shows what the strain that Ismay must have been under in this self-appointed role as the intermediary, and earning for him a reputation in Whitehall. They called him the man with the oil can. And a lot of historians have pointed out that if it hadn't been for Ismay, the relationship between the Chiefs of Staff and Churchill might have completely broken down, with constitutional crises resulting.
Can we just explore Brooke and Ismay for a moment? Because, I mean, Churchill, I think, I'm just going to stick up for Churchill here, in that I'm not saying the others don't have any pressure on them, because they are generals in the Second World War, but Churchill has the weight of a nation, indeed the weight of an empire, on his shoulders. And so he is known for being very tempestuous and all that kind of thing. But what was Brooke's relationship with Ismay? Was he, describing Ismay as Churchill's Man Friday doesn't sound like it's a Brooke quote, but then maybe it is.
That may have not have been the exact words, but certainly those were the sentiments that the Chiefs of Staff at times felt that Ismay was very much, if not a Man Friday, at least a sort of lapdog of Churchill's, which was not true, because as we've seen, as Brendan Bracken noted, Ismay was getting it in the ear from both sides. Brooke, of course, didn't mince his words with Churchill. If Brooke thought that Churchill was wrong, he'd tell him that in those words. And in many ways, that was very often what was required. Ismay tended to be rather more subtle, I'd say, with Churchill, realizing that if you said you're wrong to Churchill, Churchill's enormous ego would be so offended he would become sort of illogical. So Ismay often realizes when Churchill can be persuaded and when he can't be persuaded. And if he can't be persuaded, Ismay either changes the subject or waits for Churchill to cool down, waits for an appropriate occasion to advise Churchill, this may not be quite the right way of going about things. But Brooke will have none of that sort of approach. And as a result, it very often results in a breakdown of relations between Brooke and Churchill. And at one time, Churchill says to Ismay, I'm going to sack Brooke. He hates me. I can see it in his eyes. And Ismay says, just leave it with me for the moment. Goes and sees Brooke and quotes Churchill to Brooke. And Brooke says that's completely wrong. Actually, he may infuriate me at certain times, but I love the man. And, where would we be without him? And Ismay goes back to Churchill and says this to Churchill. No, he doesn't hate you. He loves you. And Churchill is mollified by this. And tears.
This is bringing tears to my eyes.
Dear Brookie, or I can't remember. And that's the sort of role that Ismay is playing, seeing things in context, that in this battle between egos of I'm right and you're wrong, you've got to see this in context and see that compromise must take place. Otherwise, the show will not be kept on the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think we got a very good idea from Alan Brooke's diary, not the Bryant version, which caused a certain amount of upset when they were published, but the more recent one, the unexpurgated version, and one can see there Brooke's very often justified frustration with Churchill, and some of the things that he said about him at the time were pretty stringent. But as you rightly say, it was Ismay's job to tone it down and get both sides working together. But yeah, I mean, one feels very sorry for Brooke sometimes. I mean, some of the stuff that he had to put up with and deal with.
Absolutely. And interestingly, it's when that edited edition of the diaries by Arthur Bryant is produced in 1959, it causes something of a lapse in the good relationship between Ismay and Brooke. They're both obviously retired at that time, but Ismay feels that the diaries should never have been published, that they show Churchill in a very bad light, that they betray confidences, and that it's quite wrong of Bryant to have produced the diaries. And he says so both to Bryant and to Churchill. And when the next year Ismay comes to write his own memoirs, it's very much a reaction against that publication of the Brooke diaries. That Ismay says to people, my memoirs are not going to be, revelations. They're not going to betray confidences, and they're going to be nothing like that dreadful book by Bryant and Brooke. And the result of that is sadly that Ismay's memoirs, which are a very entertaining read because he writes very well, tend to obscure the truth and tend to put a gloss on everything, that everything was fine. Churchill and the chiefs of staff, they were one big happy team. And in this book, nobody is criticized for anything. And as a result, it becomes slightly economical with the truth, Ismay's memoirs. And it's only by digging much deeper into the letters that he's written to people, their diaries of what Ismay has said to them, that you get to understand and know what Ismay really thinks about people. And in the memoirs, if you read the memoirs, you'd think, he was everybody's friend, and he had no bad word to say against anybody. You dig deeper and you find he has critical things to say about a lot of people in the war, de Gaulle in particular, but also Churchill. He's a great fan of Churchill's, but he says that Churchill is very much a flawed genius. Genius he may be, but flawed.
As the pressure is coming off towards 1945, we're getting to we're at the 80th anniversary there or thereabouts of the end of the war. But as we're getting towards the end of the war, did relations between Churchill, his chiefs of staff, and Ismay, did they begin to improve as the war is clearly going the Allies' way? And was there any kind of relationship post-war? Did they meet up for lunch socially?
Ismay very interesting about this, about VE, Victory in Europe Day in 1945, that Churchill has the chiefs of staff and Ismay for drinks at number 10, and raises his glass to them, thanks them for their wonderful support and effort and performance. And there is no response from any of the chiefs of staff. None of them say, well, Prime Minister, let us raise our glass to you, because you played such an important part. Ismay is bitterly hurt by this and passes it off in his memoirs that perhaps they were too shy or modest to make any comment, which is clearly, covering up that he felt this was a bitter moment, that they should have been more generous and given the Prime Minister some form of recognition for what he had contributed to victory.
That is poor form.
Yeah. Yes, it was poor form. I think because the other interesting thing is the way Ismay and Eisenhower were chums, and of course communicated right through, even when Eisenhower became president. It's quite interesting, John, in your book, you published the letter from Eisenhower to Ismay, referenced Montgomery's appalling memoirs. And that was interesting.
Also, it gives an interesting insight on Eisenhower's relationship with Brooke, because Brooke, in his diaries, is quite critical of Eisenhower and doesn't recommend Eisenhower as a senior commander, not least because Churchill once told Brooke that he would command the operations across the Channel, Overlord, etc., and in the end allowed an American to be appointed, and that guy was Eisenhower. So Brooke is critical, says Eisenhower's never commanded anything above a battalion, and really isn't a proper commander. Ismay is very supportive of Eisenhower and has been ever since Eisenhower arrives in London in 1942 to command American troops in Britain and plan operations across the Channel. And their friendship deepens, and on file in Ismay, amongst Ismay's papers, which are held in King's College London, and Eisenhower's papers, there are over 140 letters between them, which go from 1942 right the way through until the time when Eisenhower is President of the United States. It's a very close relationship. And Eisenhower is eternally grateful to Ismay for his support right the way through the war and afterwards.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. It really has. I mean, only two people have come out of this well. That's Ismay, of course, and Churchill. So I think we can all agree on that. Gordon, thank you very much for this. And John, of course, links to your book, Pug Ismay, are in the... I've got a very gorgeous looking cover, I've got to say. And I know we discussed the cover in the previous podcast, but it does... it's a very handsome copy. And Gordon...
Pug Ismay, soldier, statesman, diplomat.
Soldier, statesman, diplomat, as you've just illustrated in this conversation. And Gordon, I'll put a link in also for your book on Churchill, which is Blood, Sweat and Arrogance, which takes a slightly different view from my own, but importantly uses historical fact.
Well, as I've often said, Oliver, and you know very well, it doesn't matter that we have opposing views as long as it comes from the evidence. That's the important thing.
Indeed.
Exactly the same evidence, we can arrive at different conclusions. And you and I don't agree on some things, but we're both looking at the same evidence. So that's fine.
Of course. And that's what makes us all love history, I think.
Yeah.
So both, thank you very much for this. And until the next time.
Thank you, Ollie. And thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks, Ollie. See you all soon.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do get in touch either through Spotify or via email. Links are in the show notes. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.